what I hope to get out of today is that somebody else out there can pick up their camera, and the next time you're driving, doing a road trip, or even 30 miles from your house here in Houston, that you get an awesome time lapse or even a lightning photo. And you can do that with your iPhone. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to go through my presentation. All right. So you guys see my desktop?
Yes.
Okay, storm chasing the Gulf. How to capture Kansas in Houston. And the reason I say Kansas is that's like the quintessential. I think we've all watched Wizard of Oz, and that was the first tornado scene that I've ever seen in a movie, and I was addicted to it ever since. But really, it's Midwest, and so anything in the Midwest in April, May, June, if you've ever chased or just seen one of those storms, it's something out of this world, and it's just not comparable. But since the coronavirus, I have decided to do staycation and try to replicate that experience here, something that us, the kids, everybody can do. And so, what do the storms look like in Houston? Well, they look like storms everywhere else, except there are some subtle nuances here. And you do get the multicellular storms with the mesocyclones. And this is one at the very top here. That's Katie, where you get the shelf cloud, the quintessential storm. You do get mammatus clouds. So over here, this orange, and that's, I think, my favorite kind of clouds. I've seen some of the best mammatus clouds here in Houston and in 2020 this year. We do get haboobs. So I know I grew up in West Texas. We'd get these all the time. The Arizona haboobs are of epic proportions, but you do get those here from time to time. And when they do happen, it can really kick up a dust storm, as you can see right here trailing this rainbow. And then the isolated supercells. That's my favorite. So this is my passion. I try to find the supercell in its birth and chase it to its extinction. And when you find these little isolated supercells twisting above a plane, it's something that once you see it, you'll want to go chase every one of these. And then tons of lightning. So Houston, you can get a lightning shot here. I don't care where you live in Houston. Some of the storms here have some of the best lightning, and in my opinion, rival those storms up in Kansas that I've seen. So what's on the agenda for today's presentation? First things first, safety. So we'll get into that a little bit. About me, I'll go through my qualifications as a photographer and just a little bit about me personally. I'm going to go through my photography gear. I get tons of those kind of questions on my social media. People want to know, how do I get a storm photo? And there is something to say about the equipment, but we're going to cover iPhone all the way up to the most expensive, full frame cameras. The storm chase basics. So how do I even know where the storm is? And I think this is probably the most challenging aspect up front. And once you learn the basics, it's really luck and Mother Nature at play. And then we call a storm chase a setup. And so if I see a setup in the Midwest 10 days from now, that's how I plan my storm chase trip. So there's also something called the Houston setup, and this is the way I'm going to label this. And it's a little different kind of chase. And then how to capture lightning, clouds, and time lapses. And so the first thing I want to really, really hammer this one home is, and I don't think storm chasers like me, I don't think we really focus on this aspect enough, but safety first when storm chasing. And always maintain situational awareness and have an escape plan. So, like, driving into the Gulf of Mexico is not an option. And I mean that seriously, because if you're on one of the beaches here and there is a water spout, tornado, massive hail, etc., there's only so many outlets on a beach, and you can either go dunes or Gulf of Mexico or continue driving either through the storm or try to escape it. And so you really do need to understand where you're chasing and the terrain. Learn our lessons from the El Reno, Oklahoma tornado. And this is just a tragic story, but I think it needs to be said, and we should honor these folks' lives. So Tim Samaras, two others in this truck, this is their truck that day, lost their lives May 31st, 2013. And then of that day, 13 total dead. And it was a lack of maintaining situational awareness. There's tons of YouTube videos about this. I highly encourage people to go look this up. If you do decide you want to go storm chase, I think this is mandatory reading, that you need to understand what happened this day to prevent yourself from getting in this exact same situation. And what was so odd about this is not only these guys, but the Weather Channel truck also flipped over and people were injured. So we're talking seasoned veteran chasers that wrote the book on storm chasing, lost their lives. And so anybody can lose their lives. You don't play around with the storms. Way to do that is become a trained storm spotter. So I'm a trained storm spotter here, National Weather Service. I think it's Harris County. Got the certificate. You can go online. You can get the training yourself, and really going through the storm spotter training. That is the fundamentals for how to do this safely. Also, how to identify the storm, and then, in my opinion, to do what we're really supposed to be doing, and that's reporting the weather. And so I like going out and oftentimes not shooting and just really trying to hone my skills doing the spotting and reporting the weather report. I learned from the season chasers, and I think everyone, even if you don't want to be a storm chaser, Skip Talbot's YouTube series of videos on storm chasing are phenomenal. He goes into incredible, excruciating sometimes detail. And the detail here, I don't think we could replicate. So it'd be almost like rewriting the book. So it's good enough to where I think this is storm chase canon now. And if you want to look for a one to start with that goes along with the safety message, Google safety lessons from El Reno. And then the most important aspect, because storm chasers must drive from point A to point B. And a lot of times the adrenaline gets pumping and you're trying to get to this awesome setup. Practice safe driving. Never, ever, 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 and I'll throw another ever in there, put yourself or others at risk for a photograph, because the thrill of the chase, there will be another storm. There will be a storm tomorrow, but if you get hurt, there's only one of you. So please be safe out there. So that covers safety. A little about me. So I'm from Levelland, Texas. I grew up on a cotton farm, raised on the weather. So as a cotton farmer, we pay attention to it. And I took it for granted. And I know that now, living in Houston. What did I have in the panhandle? Well, I had everything you would ever need for those epic, very high base, lots of lightning, tornado setup type storms. And I just really never paid attention to it because I lived in it. And so now that I live here, I'm trying to replicate that experience. So I've got 3 children, and a lot of the storm chase for me is about giving them the ability to learn something science, and they love it. And so even my 2-year-old every day, blue skies or not, hey, Daddy, let's go storm chase. Daddy, let's go storm chase. And I think that even if they're not interested in it, getting them out and about in the elements, getting them out of the car with anemometer and showing them how to use a camera, it's fundamental for their development. So I think it's great for children. Just be safe. I'm an environmental professional and a storm chaser. So my education, I got a BS AST nuclear engineering from Thomas Edison State University, Master of Science Project Management from George Washington University. And I want to make this clear, I am not a meteorologist, and we leave that stuff to the real pros. We play one on TV though. Work, business, I founded an environmental consulting firm here in Houston in 2012, grew it up, eventually got acquired in 2017. And that's where I really started digging my teeth into meteorology, because I had a team of meteorologists that worked for me, and some of the most brilliant people on planet Earth that could do anything. They could do engineering, they could do math and science, they could do atmospheric sciences. And so we focused on atmospheric sciences, air emissions modeling for air permitting major industry. And today I'm still in that space, but I primarily work for the emissions monitoring software folks. Storm chasing spotting, I've been doing this for a long time, and as soon as I could drive. So I've got the Skywarn Spotter Convective Basics training, which I highly encourage you to go look that up, take that class. It's awesome. The role of Skywarn Spotter training, I highly encourage, and this is all free, to go look that up, take that training, and you get your certificate, and then you can start reporting the weather into the National Weather Service system. Photography. So my first shot ever taken was on a Minolta Maxim. I think I want to say it's a Minolta Maxim 7000 back in 1994. And I started with a slide photography in Colorado, hanging out on Highway 17, just shooting the Sangre de Cristo range. And that was a massive epic thunderstorm that day. So like my first photograph ever with a real camera was of a thunderstorm. I got into professional photography out of need. So I tried hiring other pros to do product photography for my guitar business, and it just wasn't translating. And so I decided to do that myself, and it helped propel my business and distinguish me from other businesses online to where we won several awards. And then full frame digital photography for over 5 years now. Before that, I had the crop sensor, and then before that, it was film photography. I'm a contributor for the Houston Visitors Guide, so I encourage everyone to go to Visit Houston, download the Visitors Guide. You'll see a few of my photos this year when they finally release the guide. You'll see a lot of my photos in there. And then I'm a contributor for Gitzo Tripods. So full disclaimer, I am a contracted contributor with Gitzo. So if I recommend a tripod, you'll guess it's probably going to be a Gitzo. Next is my gear. So what do I use? And this is something I want to make sure that when you're doing any kind of photography, but especially storm photography, don't get hung up on this part. Don't think that, oh, I don't have the latest, greatest camera, so I can't go get the cool photo. Lightning is hard, so I can't do it. I don't have a lightning trigger. I can't get a lightning photo. And I think over the years, I kind of had gear mental block. And so I still have not used a lightning trigger at all. Everything that I've done so far has been either handheld or on a tripod with long exposure. But I started off my full frame journey with the D750. It has since been cannibalized, and I've gotten an H alpha mod for astrophotography specifically to capture the red wavelengths in Milky Way and nebula. And then 99.99999% of all of my photos taken are going to be on the Nikon D850. It's just that good, in my opinion. The raw files, the dynamic range, the color rendition, the usability, the durability, the batteries. I can just go on and on. And then I've got the Sony A7R III, and that camera has its own strengths. And I don't think there's any advantages or disadvantages from a storm perspective between owning both of them. I think you should have both. I think you should have a mirrorless and then the traditional DSLR. I use the Nikon D850 for my handheld stuff, running like crazy outside the car, trying to get as many shots as possible of the clouds. And then I typically set the Sony A7R III up and just let it sit there and do the time lapse and or video. So the lens, I think, is almost more important than the body that you're using, because you need wide angle. And I've been doing this a while now, and I've now realized that 14 millimeters still isn't wide enough. I don't even know if 12 millimeters would be wide enough. I don't think they make a lens wide enough to capture what you're sitting there seeing in person when you see the most awesome thunderstorm. But for my storm shots, I'm carrying the 14 to 24, and this is literally what you see here on the screen. The only things in my bag. I don't take any other lenses. I don't bog myself down with equipment. I take one lens for the Nikon. I take two for the Sony. And so of the 99% of the shots that I take with the 14 millimeter, the other 1% is what I consider the best lens of all time. And I'll show you in just a second an example of why I think that. But when that rare occurrence happens that I'm actually shooting handheld or just trying to get stills with the Sony, the Loxia manual focus lens, which is made by Zeiss, has got to be some of the best color rendition and some of the sharpest photos I've ever seen. Also, the Sony G Master 135 millimeter. So I use that for getting up close when you don't want to. And you can do a lot of cool compression shots, point the lens up straight towards the cloud base, and get some really unique looking lightning shots if you're lucky enough to capture it on the 135.
What camera does the Zeiss lens go on?
The camera is the Sony A7R III. So this Loxia is the perfect match for the Sony A7R III. And it's an E mount made in Japan lens. So anything that's E mount, this will be compatible with. And since it's manual, it doesn't, you're going to be the one making this lens work. It even has the aperture ring and everything on it. So I love every aspect of this lens because it really forced me to relearn photography the old school way. And the 14 to 24, the only comparable lens I think now with the Sony would be that they're 12 to 24, which I'm considering getting for the Sony. So I would actually compare that back to the Zeiss Loxia when I get it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So my gear, Gitzo. Gitzo, and please don't tell Gitzo I'm not using their ball head. So I use a Gitzo Traveler tripod, and I know I'm not sponsored, but I'm a contributor for these guys. It really is a good tripod, and I've used them all. I've used all brands, and you've got to have a steady base when you're out dealing with 40 mile an hour to 100 mile an hour gusts of wind, and you're trying to battle the element and still maintain a non-shaky image. And so when I'm out and about, if I need a tripod and I'm running to and fro, I usually have the Nikon permanently attached to the Traveler, which is this one here on the left. It's nimble, fast, it adapts to constant change. I can take it straight down to the ground. I can hold it as just a handheld. And the time lapse tripod is this Gitzo GT5543 LS. It's a super heavy tripod, and I have had zero shake issues or vibration issues since I've switched to this tripod for my video work. And the ball head is the Really Right Stuff BH55. It's a pretty penny. It's very expensive for a ball head, but it takes a beating. And in a jam, you could bust out your windshield with it to get out of your car. I mean, it's just a sturdy, humongous hunk of metal that isolates the vibration, and it is super precise when you need to either calibrate or change the scene. And if you needed to, you could actually take the ball head off and put it on the Traveler. So I actually do that sometimes. It's just a really versatile piece of equipment. So when you go into the actual photography, everyone has a style. And so this is my style. And I encourage everyone to develop their style. And there's many ways you can do that. You can do it through composition, you could do it through processing, you can do it through color. You can do all kinds of things to give you a unique look. The things that I rely on heavily in my photography are scale, meaning very small foreground. So very slim, not a lot of foreground. And I'll usually throw an element in the foreground that is of known size to compare it back to the clouds. And a good comparator would be like a telephone pole, maybe a car. And that'll give you the scale and show you how big that cloud is. And so this one on the left here, that one's actually shot in Perryton, Texas. This was one of the craziest storms I've ever seen in my entire life, and I may not see one like that ever again. This was probably the best clouds I've ever seen. The drastic crop is also something that I rely a lot on. So if you go look at some of my lightning stuff, you look at a lot of my cloud photos, even this one to the left here is cropped. I crop almost everything, and I try to do it in such a way that you don't notice. There's no noise, and it makes it a unique image all on its own when you compare it back to the original image. And then with the Sony, you get this razor sharp compression. You can just zoom into your heart's content right up into the cloud base. And this is actually two mesocyclones merging, and I got the merge point here in Colorado as it was happening, taking place. And you can't really do that with any other lens other than 100. I'd say 135 would be the minimum. If I had a 200 to 500, it would probably be ideal, but it's just too heavy to take out in the field. And the Sony GM 135 is just so good that with a crop, it is so good on the detail, you really don't notice that it's a crop. So scale, extreme crops, and then perspective. That's what I rely on to make a storm photo interesting. And so, just going to give you an example of optically superior lens. Like, what do you get for your money? So, when you invest in the lens, which I've invested in some lenses, and I kind of fought that battle early on. I'd buy the non-expensive version. I'd buy the non-gold ring Nikon lens, thinking I'm saving money. And I would advise you to really think through, if you're really thinking about upgrading lenses, what type of photography are you shooting? I could have done with just buying one lens, this 14 to 24 millimeter. I don't need anything else. I could just do all of my photography with that lens. And that's just my style of photography. So now I have a shelf full of other lenses that I either need to sell or trade in. Same thing goes for the Sony lens, the Zeiss Loxia. And so I shot this on the Sony, and I also shot it on the Nikon, and I got the same image with the same camera with the tripod side by side. And I want you to look at the Zeiss Loxia crop. The color's a little different because I processed it a little differently, but I'm at the same focal length. I'm at the same everything, same, I think even same ISO, same f-stop. And I was trying to do a comparison between the Nikon and the Sony and how well a one could handle a crop. And as you can see here, the lightning on the right is the lightning on the left. So that's how extreme I'm cropping in to create an image that looks like this. And the reason I started doing that is because it's rare to find a good storm. And so if you can develop your portfolio with one image and you can come up with several different crops, you might be able to get two, three. In some of these images, I've gotten five distinct, unique images that no one would ever know it came from the same image. And so you can really improve your portfolio by relying on a really good equipment and then cropping and controlling the noise at the same time. So now into the good stuff. And this is the challenge. And this is, I think it's always going to be a challenge. I think there's always learning to do here, especially if you're not coming from a meteorological background like me. And, you know, this is a hobbyist, if not, you know, pro storm chaser career that relies heavily on the pros to tell me where to be. And there's a lot to be said for some of these models and how well we can actually accurately predict. And I'll show you some things here in a minute, how great these things are and telling you exactly where to be. But what are the variables that you need to pay attention to? And there's really only three. It's energy in the sky. And I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. Energy in the sky, potential energy in the sky, wind, and then moisture, which comes from us. So most of the Gulf moisture is what drives the Midwest storms. And so when you're looking at the energy in the sky, and I just pulled the map from today off of one of the models for the convective available potential energy, and you can see what's there sitting in the Gulf. It becomes very clear there's a lot of energy sitting in the Gulf. Well, that's the tropical storm / hurricane sitting there right now. And the model shows you exactly where you would want to be to chase that hurricane. And this is a very key to making sure you're not going to end up with a storm chase bust here in Houston. We need the frontal boundaries and we need a lot of energy in the sky in order for cloud propagation to happen, because we don't get a lot of the wind. So in the Midwest, you can see here, this is actually from today. This is great storm chase conditions from a wind perspective. This is extremely high wind coming down from the jet stream. So we've got a Canadian dip here. When you see this dip, you'll see it in the April-May timeframe. And that's what causes all of those Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska storms is the jet stream dips down and creates instability, and it gives this wind effect from our Canadian friends. And coupled with the moisture, so what I look for is a dew point of greater than 55 degrees. Realistically, I'm looking for 70 degrees and higher because I want the best of the best storms. And dew point has been one of my top indicators in the Midwest for storms. But the problem here in Houston is it's always humid. It's the dew point's always high here. So it's not the greatest indicator here because there's humid days with no convection. So it's just something to think about, though, that if you do have these three variables align here in Houston, it might be time to get in the car and take your camera for a storm chase.
Yeah. Hey, Adam, we had a question. These are just website. This is all from one website, which is listed up there on the right. Is that correct?
Yes. And I'll take you guys through that here in just a second. I'll actually go to the website and show you how those models work. And there's multiple sources where you can get this data from. The one that I like using, and I think a vast majority of storm chasers like using, is the College of DuPage website. And the URL is sitting up here at the top right. And it goes through all the models, gives you the accurate updates and data. You can get the weather soundings. You can get really in depth with this stuff. But I think their presentation is the most user-friendly. And it's also most user-friendly when you're doing it on the cell phone, which I hardly ever do any of this on the computer while storm chasing. I'm on the iPhone. And so speaking of weather models, which ones do we look at? So there's several different models out there that you could choose from, and a model is only good as its inputs. And so you have to constantly iterate, and it's an iterative process. And so if you're as obsessed with this stuff as I am, I'm looking 10 days out. Now, I'll go into the Houston chase here in just a second. So right now I'm talking about, for example, the GFS model is the long range model. And so 10 days out, November 23rd, I'm looking at Missouri. I would be considering going to Missouri. and would be driving from here to Missouri to go chase this reflectivity here. And that's the predicted thunderstorm activity. And it could be 50-50 at this point. And so as you get closer to November 23rd, you keep reiterating this model. And if it keeps generating the same result, then you can start feeling good about it. And then about 1 to 3 days out, I switch over to what's called the NAM model, which is a little higher resolution. It refreshes a little much at a higher resolution, and it will tell you whether the GFS was lying to you or not, 7 days ago. And so if the NAM and the GFS start lining up about that 3-day mark, it's go time. It's time to get in the car and go pick your spot out. And so when you get into about 18 hours, I'm starting to look at what's called the HRR model, the HRR. It's a rapid refresh model, and it has extreme resolution. And it will show you these supercells that will pop up, and it'll tell you exactly where to go to. And I just, out of anecdotal following this, I would say it's 80% true. So if the HRR, the NAM, and the GFS are all lining up, and I'm 18 hours into about to be where I need to be for the storm chase, and it's still showing that I've got reflectivity, I've got thunderstorm activity, it's probably going to be a good day. And the HRR will get you within plus or minus 10 miles of where you need to be. And that's key, because if you're just following some of these other models, I used to drive an hour, hour and a half, and that was my target. Was maybe even 2 hours was my target, was get close enough to where I could still try to find where the towers start going up. So with the HRR model, it's kind of taken some of that guesswork out. So with Houston, since we're here, there's no harm, no foul for going out every day and chasing. And so since we're here and we're not planning a massive vacation up to the Midwest for 10 straight days, I'm not so concerned about checking the GFS. I might check the NAM, but I rely probably 95% of the time. So for example, tomorrow, if I'm curious about whether I should go out in the evening, I will pull up the HRR model tonight, and I'll look at the 6 to 7 p.m., maybe start around 3 to 4 p.m. and see if there's any activity. And so right here, I pulled up for Tuesday, and this is going to be on Greenwich Mean Time. And so with tomorrow, I've got nothing. So we would strike out. This is something I probably wouldn't do. But up here in Kansas, if we were there, this is perfect. This is exactly what you want to see at the top of this model. You see the reflectivity, you see the supercells forming, and you can validate that using the radar scans and the actual pictures from the sky, which is the GOES satellite. And so that's the last step here, is that once I've picked out the target, I think I'm within plus or minus, let's say 30 miles. I'm actually starting to look at satellite imagery to see how well that's mapping up to the HRR model. And if that maps up, then I pretty much forget about the models altogether. And then you just do what you see. So when you start seeing the clouds pop up, that's where you start the chase. And the next step is when in the Houston setup do we go out? And I started thinking about the 3 variables from earlier, and how humidity for me and dew point for me just wasn't a good indicator. And so I was thinking, well, if there's going to be hail, that means it's got to have some seriously strong updrafts, especially here in Houston. And if there's strong updrafts, that means it's a supercell, and that means it's really, really severe weather. And I found data that indicates here's when all the hail events take place within Houston. And so if you look at this chart on the left, following the hail, these are the hail events, severe hail events, an inch or greater in diameter. April and May, obviously target months, but don't forget about June and August. There is kind of a dip of activity in July. I did experience that this year, but August for me this year was probably better than earlier in the season. But there are some nuances to how those storms set up. And in this season right now, with October, November, December timeframe, we would be looking for the cold fronts coming through. And that still might not produce the kind of hail that you would see in Nebraska. And so if you're going to want to go out and about, I would put my money on April and May and August, and not really worry so much about the other months. And then if you want to know what time of day, I usually start my trip at 1 p.m. And that's just become very standard and consistent here in Houston, because it seems like the storms are very consistent. They pop up just like this chart shows. it starts ramping up around 12. You'll start seeing the cumulonimbus towers start to rise on the horizon line about 12 to 1 p.m. And some of those fizzle out, some of them don't. But right around the 3:30ish p.m. mark, it's like an explosion of activity. And then it typically peaks to 4 to 5. And that's when I've gotten probably the best lightning photos. A lot of the time lapses that I've gotten of supercell activity has been between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m. here in Houston. And if you're curious about all the surrounding areas and counties, where should you go? I was actually kind of shocked by this graph when I first saw it. Harris County is almost order of magnitude higher on severe weather events than any of our surrounding areas, like Brazos, Brazoria, Burleson, Chambers, 864 weather events. And I think the next one down is Montgomery, which is close to the Woodlands at 281. So Harris County, if you chase Harris County, you've got a very strong likelihood of catching a severe storm weather event relative to these other counties. Now, there is a caveat and there's a catch here. So yes, there's a lot more storm activity in Harris County, and I've seen that personally, but it is frustrating because trees, traffic, and buildings equal tons of missed opportunities and shots. And so I've pretty much just written off, if it's going to happen in Houston, I'm not there. I'm not going to chase it, because this is my house here in Katy. And I know the folks up in the Woodlands right now, you can attest to how many trees you have. The trees are not your friend when it comes to storm chasing. It blocks. It's actually a safety issue because you can't see what's coming. But from a photography perspective, you just can't get the perspective that you need with the open clearings to see the clouds. The other thing is, remember when our peak time was, it was 4 to 6 p.m. Well, what happens to I-10? What happens to 99? What happens to 45 from 4 to 6 p.m.? And so if you're trying to storm chase and you've got hail, you've got rain, and you have the worst rush hour traffic of all time, you're not only going to risk getting flooded out, but you're going to risk your car getting damaged from hail, and you're not going to get any photos, and you're going to be sitting there hitting your steering wheel, yelling at the radio for being on I-10 during one of the best storms you've ever seen while it passes by, and you're no exit in sight. So I just don't deal with the Harris County traffic. Even though it's a great storm, it's likely that you're going to get caught in traffic. And then the other aspect is, it seems like every time I go shopping, I go to the grocery store. I used to call myself the Whole Foods storm chaser, because every time I get out of the car, I look up, I'm like, there it is. That's like the best storm I've ever seen. And this is your foreground. And so it's chasing in the urban areas. It's not attractive for me. It's not attractive from a photography standpoint. You've got cars, parking lots, buildings, telephone poles. But as you can see here in the Whole Foods parking lot, that's some of the prettiest clouds I've seen all season in Houston, and I couldn't get to them because I believe this was also during rush hour traffic. So you just kind of watch it pass on by. So what's the solution? I have, through multiple iterations, triangulation, used my abacus, lots of failure, come up with 3 areas that have consistently driven results for me. And they're totally different in how you approach them. The first one is the beach, and Sargent, Texas is kind of my home base. I like that area. I like East Matagorda Bay. There's not a lot of folks that get in your way there, and there's a lot of open clearing and beach. And the storms typically follow this kind of pattern that you're seeing here, where they're running right parallel to you. So you're sitting on the beach watching these things drive right on by. It's the perfect scenario. In some cases, you have the bay as your foreground. And then in some cases, they're actually in the Gulf and you're watching them drive right on by.
Which beach is that again? I'm sorry.
This is Sargent, Texas, and it's right close to East Matagorda Bay. And then the other area that has been my go-to for Milky Way shots, beach photography. If you've seen me shoot a Texas beach scene, it's going to be at inlet number 4, which is on Blue Water Highway in between Surfside and Galveston. And inlet number 4 for me is like the perfect balance for light pollution, because I do Milky Way shots and I like doing nighttime lightning. And so it's halfway in between the industry and Galveston. It's one of the darker skies that you're going to find on the beach in Texas. And it's a nice wide open beach, and it's easy inlet, easy access. So remember, safety. These 2 areas I know how to get out of. I know how to get in and get out in case I get in trouble. So for example, this storm, this one actually turned on me and turned right at me. And so I was able to evade the storm and get back on the road and get out of there and get to safety. The other, this is probably my favorite locations, US 59 and the rice fields. And so the rice paddies, the cotton fields, the cornfields, the agriculture. And I was actually shocked growing up from a cotton family in West Texas to see how strong the agricultural community here is in Houston and how much of it there is. I was shocked to see flat land. And so if you chase around El Campo, that whole area has got tons of great networks of highway, which is key. You want a good road because if you can't get to it, you can't shoot it. And this is the dream scenario right here. And this is an isolated supercell that just popped up out of nowhere. And I ended up chasing this one for about 3 hours or so and ended up getting some of the best rainbow. That was the Haboob shot from earlier. So this one actually produced a Haboob. And it was just the perfect scenario because everywhere else around me was blue sky. And I'm watching this storm and I'm able to stay behind it. I was also able to get in front of it because how good the road networks are. And then there was nothing obstructing my view. So I don't have the trees to deal with, nothing in the way. And then you can line up nicely with a cotton field and get some really nice perspective with some telephone poles on the horizon line to demonstrate the scale. So with I-10, this is my home. And, there's something to be said for staycation, especially now in the time that we live in. And some of the lightning, I think the best lightning that I've gotten all year has been 5 to 10 minutes from my house. And it just seems to be these storms will pop up north of Katy. Sometimes they'll actually originate close to the woodlands and track on down. But most time it pops around Pattison, Katy will form around 3 to 4 p.m. and they love to hop over I-10 and continue south. And so I've hit almost every one of these that I can this year. And this is probably the most successful in my storm chasing because these storms, as you can see, this one is an actual mesocyclone, meaning it's got a lot of rotation. It has all those cool things that you want to see for photography. You've got the shelf cloud, you've got the hail, you've got the lightning. So this had everything you want. And you can contrast that over here to this El Campo isolated little supercell here. There's a couple of lightning bolts versus this one in Katy, which is lightning everywhere. And so you almost had to mess up not to get a picture of lightning on this one. And it's just right down the street from me. And it seemed to be every day in May. It seemed to be every day almost in June. And then almost every day in August, one of these would pop up like clockwork. And you have a lot of flat rice areas here. There's nothing obstructing your view. And so these are the types of chases that I do now. And I opt for doing these things. Whereas before I would chase just about anything in Houston and then end up getting stuck in traffic. So what do these things look like? And so at the beach, so this is actually inlet number 4. This is Christmas Bay. And this was that derecho that came through in May, that massive front system that came through and swept through. And I've started this one at I-10 and Highway 6. And I stuck with it. This is one of the rare times where I was able to, within Houston, stay in front of the storm the entire time. And so that's something I would like to reiterate, that your positioning here, you heard me say behind, got in front of it. I like to stay in front of the storm because I like to see the shelf cloud. I also like to make sure I stay in control of the storm. If you get behind the storm, you will never, ever get back in front of it ever again, unless you do what's called core punch, meaning you're driving through that insanity to get back in front. So always try to maintain in front of it, maintain a safe distance. And then you can also track where it's going to turn. So this one actually turned right towards me. The El Campo, that one little supercell, did this. And so it did a kind of a downburst and it created a Haboob and some of the best rainbows I've ever seen. And you can see the foreground in both of these images, there's no obstructions. It's nothing but field on both of these. And then my home. So Katy to Sealy, that corridor in I-10, for some reason, every single day had something to offer. And so this one right here was one that I saw it on the HUR. I said, this is about to happen about 2 hours ahead of time. And I went to exactly where the HUR model told me to go. And this is what happened. And so it was one of those rare moments where I parked on the road and this just drove right next to me and I didn't get wet. So I didn't get rained on, didn't have any hail, but I got some great lightning photos. So I would encourage y'all that if you want to chase, trying to chase the woodlands is very difficult. I've tried it. I've tried to chase East Texas to Beaumont. There's a lot of good setups that happen in Lake Charles in Louisiana. It's just a nightmare scenario if you get yourself in a legitimate storm that's throwing hail and maybe 80-mile-an-hour wind. You need to see what's going on and be able to see what's in front of you. So this is something I think that if you're going to be a Houston-based storm chaser, you just need to say no to these things. And I've chased several. And what I've learned from chasing the hurricanes is, yes, you'll get the cool footage of you, like we've all seen Reed Timmer in the hurricane doing the selfie with the wind blowing in his face. You know, that's cool, but that's a whole different thing altogether than trying to get a great photo of a storm. And so all I've found in the hurricanes is nothing but pain, misery, and danger. And I've chased every hurricane that's happened this year, and I've come up short on anything photogenic. And all I found was dangerous flooding, streets closed down, people driving like crazy to evacuate, the authorities telling you to get out, and you could get yourself killed in these scenarios. And some of these winds coming off of these hurricanes, I got 67, 68 miles per hour on my monitor, but these right here don't offer anything photogenic at all. It doesn't give you the supercell activity that you're looking for, and you're just going to get rained out. So I just want to, this is part of that safety message, is that if you want to go chase this, great. Just make sure you know what you're doing. But if you're a photographer like me and you like taking pictures of cool storms, from my experience, I've just found nothing here. And so let's contrast Houston versus the Midwest, because the name of this presentation is let's find a piece of Kansas in Houston. And so I want to contrast what those storms look like up there versus what's down here, because you're not going to get the storms like you get up there. It's just they're just a different scenario. It's a different wind. It's a different feel, the different frontal systems, and they produce stuff like this where I'm running for my life. I wasn't photographing this. I was literally running from the storm for about 6 hours to get to a road that could make me go straight south. So I was actually running almost parallel to this thing, trying to head south as quickly as I possibly could, because up there, these storms will move about 75 miles an hour. I think this one was moving 75 miles an hour. And so you're going the same speed as the storm. And if you've ever seen something like that, you know, we've all seen the time lapses with the storms moving fast. These storms move fast. And so it looks like a time lapse as it's coming at you. And you can see the many multi-cells in here that are embedded. I haven't really seen that to this degree in Houston. Any one of those could pop out a tornado. So the tornado risk up there is extreme. Houston used to be kind of Tornado Alley, and it's shifted towards Mississippi. And so I think, you know, if you're expecting to go out during storm chase season and get something like this, I think you're going to be a little bit disappointed, but you can get close when the fronts come through in April and May, but that's about it. But this kind of stuff happens regularly in the Midwest. And so the Storm Prediction Center is something that I would encourage you guys to look at, that if you're really wanting to see what's going to happen within the next couple of days, they post these outlooks, and you can get this information from the National Weather Service and just go Google Storm Prediction Center. And so this is actually the storm prediction for this particular day. And, you know, win one for the team meteorologist, because they nailed it. It was exactly where they said it was going to be. And it was actually a lot worse than what they were predicting. And so I drove from Houston to there based on this information and the other models that lined up with their prediction. So this is an example of what a storm chase in the Midwest looks like versus the small supercells that pop up around Houston that go across I-10. A whole different ball game when you're up there. So capturing lightning, how do you do it? And I really got into storm photography because of lightning. I didn't get into storm photography to take pictures of storms. I just wanted to get a bolt of lightning. That's what really got my interest here. And in my opinion, there's really 4 ways to get lightning: handheld, which is crazy, lightning trigger, which I've never used, long exposure on a tripod, which has some disadvantages, and then time lapse on a tripod, which also has some disadvantages. And so just kind of take you through some of this. This image right here is actually a time lapse sunset in Katy that the camera captured automatically. So this is out of sight, out of mind. So this was one of those lucky ones where the lightning decided to strike when the camera exposed. So handheld is usually what I do. And so I'm actually going into the field, and I typically have it on the high frame rate mode. I think I'm at 9 frames per second with the battery pack on. And I've got a very high transfer rate on my data card with a buffer, so I can take up to 100 images without slowing down. And so my advice to you is if you want to try that route, it's really non-traditional way, but I've gotten some of the craziest lightning photos ever with my handheld approach versus me trying to get them on a tripod and just waiting for it to happen. So I shoot wide open f2.8. And the reason I do that is because I want to keep the ISO on that digital camera as low as possible. I want to stay at native ISO. So that way I'm maximizing the dynamic range. Shutter speed 1/80th of a second plus, so that way you can maintain handheld. And then the high frame rate. And then you can just wing it sometimes. So I got if you go on my Instagram at Adam Kyle Jackson and you look at some of my New Mexico, the Roswell shots were shot me clicking the shutter manually without doing the high frame rate. And I just got lucky that day. But I oftentimes wonder how many shots did I leave on the table, which is something to be said for using the lightning trigger. So long exposure is the other route. And that's typically for nighttime images when it's too dark and you can just put the camera on a tripod and you can set it from 3 to 30 seconds, depending on what the ambient light situation is around you. The disadvantage to this approach is the clouds will blur. You'll see motion blur typically in the clouds, which I don't like. And so that's why I have opted for handheld, because I like to freeze the motion in the sky. I want the clouds to be razor sharp. I want the lightning to be perfectly exposed. I want it all perfect because that's what storm chasers do when they take photos. We're perfectionists on this stuff, but on the long exposure, sometimes there's just no way you can get the lightning photo without doing long exposure. So there's nothing wrong with it. The 30-second route is when it's super dark outside and you don't see anything. A lot of my Big Bend photos are at 30 seconds, and whatever lightning decides to strike during that 30 seconds gets exposed to the frame. And so you'll get like multiple lightnings on one frame. And it looks really cool. It looks like you're doing a composite, but really you're not. It's just a 30-second exposure. The other thing is time lapse. And so time lapse is kind of cruise control. There's some luck because you're not doing anything to the camera. So that's another reason I don't really like not having my manual camera with me, because time lapse just does what time lapse is going to do. The camera is going to click at whatever rate you told it to click. And if lightning decides to strike during one of those clicks, you got lucky. And so this was me getting lucky here on the left side that happened to strike during one of my 3-second frames on the A7R3. Because I have found in my career that lightning is extremely sneaky and it often likes to strike between the frames almost every time. And then there's the lightning trigger. So this is next year's adventure. And so as soon as storm season fires up, I'm going to give a nice shout out to my buddies at Strike Finder. Strike Finder Trigger have sent me a trigger of theirs to evaluate, and I will be doing a full review on that and posting stuff to my social media for those guys come hopefully April, maybe even March if we're lucky with some lightning. So processing the images, this is probably, aside from the meteorological aspect, the other most difficult thing to do. And that's just with any photography. It took me years to figure out what my process was for processing photos. I've gone through many iterations of people and feedback, and I love the feedback. But you also do get some of the people that are trolls, and they'll get on your social media and say mean things to you. Just let that kind of roll off your back. You're going to learn, and I'm still learning. And find some people that you trust, like the photography group here, that you could submit image to and say, hey, do you like this? What could I do to improve? And that's what I do. So I do that with my Facebook group. I do it with Instagram. And I'm open to interpretation. So somebody might like it, somebody might not. I might agree with them, I might not. And so this is my process that I developed. There is no right or wrong way here. These are the tools that I use. I use Lightroom. I use Topaz Labs for sharpening and denoise. I use DxO Nik Collection, which is a set of plug-in filters that go into Lightroom and Photoshop. And then I finish off the images in Photoshop. And so, for example, this one right here, this is out the car window. And on this I had no time because the hail was coming, but it just looked cool. So I just opened up the window and I shot, and this is what I got. And so I wanted to show the blue and I wanted to accentuate the clouds. And I wanted to make sure that that was the focal point here. And so how do you do this? I adjust the exposure and color balance in Lightroom. That's usually the step one for me. And then in the HSL panel, the hue, saturation, and luminance, I will do fine tuning of the colors. And then I'll also even out the exposure in this image. And so I can see on even on this image, I could have done a better job of pulling out some of the shadows in the trees down here at the bottom. I think those trees are dead. That's why they're darker than the others, but I could have fixed that in Lightroom. And you can use the gradient filters and radial tools using various masks to what I call even out the exposure, make the image look balanced. Because oftentimes what happens is you're exposing to the highlights. And so the clouds will be perfectly exposed, but your foreground will be completely dark. And so you're going to have to do some shadow recovery. And it's for that reason why a full frame camera is almost mandatory for doing this kind of stuff.
Is most,
Oh, go ahead.
is most of what you do, I guess, I don't know how to call it commercial or what, you're not worried about being true to what you saw necessarily. If you go to a contest, you can do very limited touching and all that. But what you're doing and selling, you can do whatever you want to. It's the end that counts, not how you got there, right?
Exactly. And I do a lot of the natural ones. And, you know, at the end of the day, I go back and I look at those and I'm looking at my storm photos as kind of artwork, like they're paintings. And so when people come to me and they want to buy a print, they're wanting to buy these. And I do have the naturally processed ones. This one's actually fairly close to the raw file. And I think that's why I put this one up. So if you looked at the raw file compared to this process, there's not a lot of difference. And we also need to keep in mind that when you do shoot in raw on your camera, it's also not the representation of what you see, because you're not fulfilling the full amount of all this color saturation, dynamic range, contrast, all those things that the eye sees. And so you do have to do certain things to the raw file to get it to even look true to nature. And so I think that's anyone's guess, you know, and there's people that do come and they'll say, hey, look, that looks photoshopped, or, hey, you should lay off the saturation. And I do take those things to heart. And I will go back, and in a lot of cases, I do change what I'm doing. And I learn through humility. And so that way you continue to grow. And then I also am confident enough now in my approach that if I do process something and I know that I've maybe taken some creative license there, I'm still good with it, you know. And so there is a balance there that if you want to be pro commercial and you're trying to do editorial work, yes. So like when I do, for example, the Houston Visitors Guide, and I take photos for those guys, I'm working within a very confined set of boundaries that they've given me to make the work look consistent with everything else that we're doing. And a lot of times that doesn't involve a lot of processing. But with my photos for storms, yeah, this is artwork. And to push the files as hard as I'm pushing on some of these, I'm going to give credit to Topaz Labs denoise and the D850, which is a match made in heaven. So the dynamic range and shadow recovery on the D850, in my opinion, it just, there's no other camera that can do what the D850 can do.
Great.
And go ahead.
Great, thanks.
Yep. And with the D850 and the A7R3, you know, I've got a very good comparison there. And the A7R3 just doesn't pull the data out of the details as good as the D850. The A7R3 suffers from color banding issues, noise in the shadows, magentas, greens in the shadows. It gets splotchier faster given same exposure than the D850 would, if that makes sense. And so if I'm pulling out all this data from the shadows, it's going to get noisy. So Topaz Labs helps fix that noise issue. I can't say enough about those guys. I probably wouldn't be able to do a lot of what I do without that denoise step. And then once I get everything from an exposure, color, and noise perspective where I want it, that's when I throw it into the Nik collection. This is where the magic happens. This is where you can take it too far, make one image look like an HDR, and it's a practice that you have to just try over and over again to get a filter that makes sense for you. I used to save filters in Nik collection and use the same ones over and over. I was asked this question the other day on my Instagram live. They said, "What filters do you use?" And I said, "I don't. I start from scratch every photo I edit. And I look at each individual photo as a project in and of itself. And then only once it's done, then I look at it relative to the other photos, and I might do some minor color correction so it looks consistent to the other photos. But with Nik Collection, this is a tool that's been around forever. And it was started by Google, used to be free, but our good friends at DxO bought it and now they sell it. It is worth its weight in gold if you're into using these types of plugins and filters. And so I rely a lot on filters and masks in Color Effects Pro. So I'm not adding contrast or really anything like that in Lightroom. I'm adding the contrast step here. I also don't typically use vignette. I use what's called darken, lighten, center, which is kind of like a portrait tool where you do highlight something in the center and you do make the external part of the image darker, and it gives it a nice halo. You can go too far with it, but I think that's what gives my images its distinct look. I think it's that part right there. And then glamour glow, if anyone here has heard of the Orton effect and have used the Orton effect to success in landscape photography, I also use Orton effect in weather photography, which I think gives my images a certain look. You can achieve that effect very easily with a tool called Glamour Glow, another portrait tool that I've adapted over to the storm photos. And then skylight filter is just magic. It's something that you can fix a not so good sunset that didn't have the saturation you were looking for. This is the creative license piece. So if you do use skylight filter, you're adding orange to areas that didn't exist. But it does help a lot in balancing out some of these images and giving some interest, as long as you don't go too crazy with it. And then once I'm done with all of the crazy edits in Nik Collection, then I go into Photoshop. And then I take it another step. And this is dodge and burn, which means make things darker, make things lighter. And this can be a tedious process. It can be as tedious as you want it to be. I typically spend about 30 minutes doing this. And I'll also go through and do the pixel peep and remove the spots in Photoshop. I don't use the Lightroom spot removal anymore. It just doesn't work as good as doing Photoshop and the eraser tool or the Band-Aid tool. And I also do final contrast and color adjustments in Camera Raw just to make sure I got it right. And then I'll do a sharpen mask in Photoshop and then export it to PNG. So this is my processing that I literally use for every photo, right down to even Milky Way, landscape, and storm photos. It's the same process. But again, I start from zero. I don't save any of these filters, and I do each individual image like it's its own project. So time lapses. And so this was my first time lapse. And I'll stop talking for just a second so you can watch this. And so this was, I have gone back in my career of 5+ years, 10+ of actually storm chasing, lamenting every day that I didn't set up a tripod and do time lapse. And I had a great interview this morning with Mike Oblinsky, who is time lapse master. So if you've ever seen Thor 2, his time lapses are used in the Thor movies as the cloud backdrops. He's that good. And I started looking at his stuff this year, and I went back and I was like, wow, I really regret not doing time lapse. And now I feel a little bit better about myself for not doing them, because I don't think I would have had the photos that I have in my portfolio if I had been more focused on this route. So it's kind of a blessing in disguise to have not discovered time lapse. So this is my first time lapse. I did this in my front yard from Katy, Texas. Literally had the 200 to 500 Nikkor lens, looked crazy to the neighbors sitting in the street, and was photographing a storm that was over the downtown Houston area. It's about 30 miles away from my house. And this will show you what a compression shot looks like. So I'm getting lightning on a time lapse at 500 millimeters from Katy, Texas over Houston, Texas. And I think this was in August. And then I just went time lapse crazy. And so I started enjoying doing this. This is one of the reasons why I have 2 cameras, and now I'll always take 2 cameras in the field, because I'm not going to give up on my stills. I think I'm always going to be a still photographer when it comes to lightning photos and storm photos. But it's always nice having that Sony sitting on another tripod that you just kind of forget about, and it captures something like this. And so I'm getting better. And so here is, I think, the first time I was happy with a time lapse. And this was shot first week of September. I think this was September 4th or 5th. That was that Katy storm across I-10. And I just got lucky on this one. But I did this one right. I set it up. I got positioned perfectly per the models. And as a stills photographer, I get into the storm. So I want to get as close as humanly possible under the base of the storm. I want to see the wall cloud rotating on top of me. That is not what you do for time lapses. Time lapse, you need to have some distance between you and the storm, maybe a mile or more. So that gives you time to set up, and you also want to get at least 300 to 500 good images. And I typically set up from about a second to 3 seconds for those exposures. And as long as you're getting about 300 to, I'd say 300 to 500, you can make a nice short video just like this one. And I think everybody that has an iPhone can do this. And so this is right off I-45 on the way down to Galveston. And I just saw out of the corner of my eye, I said, that's a supercell popping up right here. And the rest of the sky was relatively blue. And so this is what I love about Houston. It's these small supercells with lots of convection that rotate. I got out of the car. I didn't have my camera with me. Don't ever make that mistake. I will never make that mistake again. And I just decided to try out the time lapse mode on the iPhone, and I did this handheld. And I think I got a pretty decent shot. So when you're looking at something like this, you can imagine that if you did have the full frame camera set up and you track this thing from birth to its death, you would get some very epic photos. And so this one actually grew into a multicellular storm and generated tons of hail, lightning, and I didn't have my camera with me. But I wanted to demonstrate that anybody on this call, on this presentation right now, can do a time lapse, and I would encourage you to do so. And there's a real easy trick to doing this, that if you're not sure exactly what to do, I've started laying my phone down on its face on the ground and pointing it straight up to the sky when I see cool things happening in the sky, and just letting it record on time lapse mode, and then taking a look at it and seeing what I get. And you'd be surprised some of the cool stuff that you see. You'll get convection. And if you're lucky enough to be up underneath a wall cloud or something like that, you're going to get a really neat video. So I've oftentimes got my iPhone also recording in the background alongside the A7R3 just to get some cool B-roll footage, just like this. So resources for learning. So Mike Olbinski, I mentioned him earlier. I've got an interview with him that's going to come out. I encourage you to go to my YouTube, his YouTube, to check out our discussion on storm chasing. And so this guy, I think if you're interested in time lapse photography, just period, and also storm chase, I think Mike Olbinski is the gold standard. And that's a bold statement, but once you see his stuff, you'll understand he's been doing it for a long time. Some of his first time lapse work was 2011. So he was one of the first. He was one of the first to go 8K and do cinematic style time lapses of these storms. And the way he positions, it's a little different than what we would do, because he's out in Phoenix and he gets the sandstorms and the haboobs. But I encourage you to go look at Pursuit, Monsoon, Vorticity, give you a really good idea of what all of us out here are looking. We're chasing Mike. You know, he's got it down. And then maybe everybody's here heard of Pecos Hank. Maybe you haven't. He's super famous, renowned storm chaser from Houston. And of the people out there that I know of that have seen tornadoes, he might be the winner. So he's been doing this from the 90s, and he posts all those videos to YouTube. Go check out his storm chaser tutorials. The in-depth weather presentation analysis from his point of view, he kind of just cuts to the chase, and he just tells you the shortcuts and says, hey, if you want to get a cool looking storm, just do this. And I followed a lot of what he says, and it does work. Skip Talbot, if you want to go to school, so Skip, I don't know if he's volunteer, but I know he's affiliated with College DuPage, and he does a lot of seminars, but his storm chasing basics, advanced tips, and safety videos, in my opinion, are my Bible for storm chase. And it is the most in-depth, informative tutorial that I think you could possibly find and watch. And he takes you through every step of the process, every website, the whole 9 yards. And then College DuPage is the set of tools. That's where you'll find the forecast that you'll need. And then if you want to get the radar, the cool looking radar screens that I was showing earlier in this presentation, it's RadarScope. And I've tried them all. I've tried all the radar tools. I've signed them up. I've bought them all. I've signed up for all of them. And I keep coming back to RadarScope. It's just because it works. It's a great tool. It gets you the resolution you're looking for, because the last thing that you want is a radar that doesn't refresh, and you're working on data that's 5 minutes behind. And RadarScope has been a very accurate representation of what's going on. It also shows you where the vortexes are in the storm, so you don't get yourself in trouble. So chasing in Nebraska, Kansas, you can definitely get yourself in trouble. You can get yourself killed. And so relying on radar scope to tell you where the tornado is at when you can't see anything, it can actually save your life. So that tool has actually saved my life maybe a couple of times this year. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. So I'll open it up to questions. We can talk about storm chase. We can talk about storm photography. We can talk about gear.